It's The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. We say 4 Paris-based correspondents, but we've gone cross-channel for this one. Nico Hines, London editor of the Daily Beast, joins us. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
Also with us, German television producer Ulrike Koltermann. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Catherine Fields, Europe correspondent for New Zealand Media.
Bonsoir.
Busy week?
Busy week. Very busy week.
And Victor Mallet, Paris bureau chief for the Financial Times. How are you?
Good, thanks.
The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag World This Week. An anniversary commemoration. Well, it's a chance to reflect on 2 moments in time, really. Then and now.
I thought I was going to drown. I went off a landing craft in a Jeep, and the Jeep sunk, and I had to swim in.
All right, they're one of the D-Day veterans speaking. That man had never been back to the Normandy beaches, and this 75th anniversary, you had the sense, Catherine Field, that well, this was the last one.
This is the last one, I think, with veterans, which is a real shame because it's when you're actually talking to the veterans that you get an actual feel of what happened, what they went through. If you're in the pool enclosures with the media and you're just sort of bussed from one place to the other and you see politicians making speeches, you don't get the sense of what the human cost was of D-Day. And I'm always so moved when you meet these veterans at these events, just how humble they are. When you say to them, thank you, and they say, I did nothing. You know, I just came ashore, I did this, I did that. And it's also moving when you're with the local French people. They're still coming out, France, all these people who weren't even born, come out to these small villages when the veterans are there and say, thank you, thank you. And you're right, I think this will be one of the last when we see the veterans, the guys who came ashore on D-Day, which will make it more difficult, I think, for future generations to connect in the way that we've been connecting with them up till now.
Yeah, first-hand stories. Victor, you and I were at an event on Wednesday in the Normandy city of Caen. There was one African-American veteran who reminded us that he landed on D-Day but only got the right to vote 10 years later. And those kinds of first-hand stories, this is almost the last chance.
I think that's right. And also, those veterans remember how extremely bloody it was. You know, as a child in the UK in the 1960s, you were led to believe in the glory of war, the glory of Dunkirk, the glory of D-Day. But when you read accounts or hear the veterans talking about those days, the day of the landing on D-Day and the days afterwards, it was extremely bloody, close fought, battles in the bushes and fields of Normandy, and it was extremely nasty kind of warfare on all sides, and it's really important to remember that. I thought the other interesting thing was during the week of these D-Day commemorations, we had both Queen Elizabeth of the UK and Emmanuel Macron of France reminding Donald Trump, of the importance of standing up for liberty and freedom, and that this was in America's, great traditions of doing that. And I thought it was quite significant that they both felt the need to remind him, of what made America great and why people still look to America and why they hope to continue looking to America as a defender of freedom and democracy.
Yeah, Nico Hines, in the case of Queen Elizabeth, of course, in a sense, we are talking about a World War II veteran, since she never left London and played a part during the war.
Yeah, and she said this week that the last time there was one of these big celebrations that everyone was saying, this is the last time you'll see real veterans, this is the last time I'll be around. And of course, she was here still going strong. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility of, say, the 80th anniversary still having some of those survivors, because these people are so tough and so impressive. It is true that she gave that message to Donald Trump. And I think it would be fair to probably expect that Donald Trump didn't really take the message on board. He doesn't really seem to take many messages on board. His speech kind of tried to sound as though he was supporting these tough alliances. But actually, when you looked at the detail of what he was saying, he didn't make any commitments to the actual alliances such as NATO, which sprang out of this conflict and which have kept us safe ever since. So I suspect he just enjoyed the photos and he'll be heading back home without it having too much effect on him, whatever he says in his Fox News interviews.
Yeah, Ulrike Kolterman, Donald Trump, in the speeches he gave, both the toast at with the Queen and the speech he gave at Omaha Beach on D-Day, he employed the word crusade quite a lot.
Yeah. Anyway, he behaved a little bit as if D-Day was like Donald Day, but there was a lot of irony in the whole thing because he came to celebrate something that an ally defended Europe, and that was something that he would never do today. So it was very ironic that he celebrated these veterans for something that he would not support today. He even said last year before the NATO summit, why should we defend Montenegro, for instance, if Montenegro was attacked? So he's not at all, he doesn't share the political views of his predecessors anymore. So his presence was sort of comical in a way, and sad.
Nico Hines saying that it's hard to get the message through to the U.S. president. And Emmanuel Macron making it crystal clear that in trying to get through that message, paying tribute very vocally to those institutions that came out of World War II, the UN, NATO, a Europe at peace, all within earshot of the current U.S. president.
We know what we owe to America. America, dear President Trump, which is never as great as when it fights for the freedom of others. America, which is never as great as when it shows its loyalty to universal values that its founding fathers defended when almost 2 centuries ago, France came to support its independence.
Are we just living in a world where, I guess, people can just kind of show up at these... It was a strange D-Day. I mean, people can show up and kind of just talk at cross purposes.
I think it's very easy to say, look, Donald Trump did well. But in fact, all he did was read his speeches. He behaved relatively well, and 90% of the time he was okay. But his speech was so out there. This was supposed to be a time when we're looking ahead, looking at what Europe can do, looking at what the alliances can do, looking at what can be achieved from peace. And he was talking about, quite rightly, what happened on D-Day. But this is all about to be looking ahead, looking at what we can achieve, not this kind of weird speech that was, hey, as you say, look at me, it's Donald Day.
It could have been a lot worse, though. Given his previous record, it could have been a great deal worse.
Last time he didn't even go to honor the veterans because it was raining in November. But what is also said that he never really talked about America's role today. So it was a lot of shoulder clapping with Macron and showing off a sort of transatlantic relationship that doesn't exist anymore.
He was more interested in talking about the Queen. You were saying it was Donald Day. Even in France, he kept on saying how much, what an amazing lady Queen Elizabeth was, and how he and she got on really well these days.
So Victor Mallet, there was, after the ceremony at the American Cemetery above Omaha Beach, a lunch that took place in Caen between the 2 presidents, Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump. If they're just kind of talking at cross purposes, what was that lunch all about?
I think it was about sort of trying to keep the relationship on an even keel, to be honest. The French, I think, were very worried that it would all, that Trump would start tweeting the way he did. He often does when he's about to arrive somewhere or when he's just left.
Like he did before Armistice Day and last
Exactly.
November.
And, he was kind of insulting Trump. Trump was insulting Macron about the Gilets jaunes and that kind of thing. So there's always the risk, and that didn't happen, which I think was a good thing. But in terms of substance, as you were saying, the idea that there will be sort of substantive talks about America's role in a future transatlantic alliance, that was never going to happen. They did allegedly talk, or apparently talk about, certain issues of the day, like Libya and Iran and so on. But I think it was, in terms of what the French and the Europeans wanted out of this, and even the British, probably, it's to some extent it's about damage limitation.
Yeah, it's sort of become the new normal, this kind of awkwardness during his 3-day state visit to the UK. Donald Trump sparing Theresa May the rough treatment of last year. You'll recall at the Prime Minister's country residence, Chequers, at that time he had praised her rival, Boris Johnson, in her presence. It was awkward. This time, he was much more gracious in her presence when they held a joint press conference. He could afford to be. he knew it was 3 days before she stepped down as leader of the Conservative Party, a Conservative Party unable under her watch to deliver Brexit.
Obviously, it will be for whoever succeeds me as Prime Minister to take this issue forward. What is paramount, I believe, is delivering on Brexit for the British people. And I seem to remember the President suggested that I sued the European Union, which we didn't do. We went into negotiations and we came out with a good deal.
Yeah, that's not such a... I would have sued, but that's okay. I would have sued and settled, maybe, but you never know. She's probably a better negotiator than I am.
So, Nico Hines, that's said in kind of a glib manner, and you can hear the journalists laughing at it. It's kind of become the new normal, these kinds of remarks. But if you suddenly suffer sense of humor failure, it's quite serious what the President of the United States is saying, sue the European Union.
Yeah, and I detected a hint of sarcasm in his suggestion that perhaps he thought Theresa May was a better negotiator than him. I think one thing we know for sure about Donald Trump is that he doesn't think anyone's a better negotiator than him. So I think that was a little jibe in her direction. But, you know, the things that he suggests are just completely crazy. Obviously, Britain couldn't sue the EU over this. Having said that, I think even some of the serious politicians and Boris Johnson, I don't know if we include him amongst the serious politicians, but I think a lot of politicians here do believe that there could have been a better job of negotiating this Brexit deal with the EU. Theresa May has been an absolute failure when it came to that. And, you know, she formally stepped down about an hour and a half ago, and it was just a press-released letter that said she was leaving today officially.
A non-event.
It was a sad, forgettable end to a sad, forgettable premiership.
Well, she stays on as caretaker prime minister while we wait to see if Boris Johnson does become the next leader of the Conservatives and thus the next prime minister. Nico, one of the other important aspects before we talk about the leadership contest is during this 3-day state visit, how did it go between the U.S. president and his hosts when it came to talking about the big, beautiful trade deals they'd have post-Brexit?
Well, Donald Trump got himself in all sorts of tangles. You may know that one of the things that Britons love more than anything is our National Health Service. It's kind of like a religion in this country. And Donald Trump, in that joint press conference, said that it was on the table when it comes to negotiating a trade deal. And that would mean that we would potentially change the way that drugs are acquired in this country for the National Health Service, which provides for everybody, to allow the big US companies to make more money from our health service. And that is absolute electoral suicide, anyone that was to sign up to that. There are other aspects of the potential trade negotiation, such as the other example that's become famous is this chlorinated chicken, which is allowed in the US, not allowed under EU rules. And these things really have caught the public imagination. And so it's going to be extremely difficult, and it's going to be very sensitive for any Prime Minister to try and convince the British people that they should allow these substandard, what they see as substandard anyway, American regulations to come in here. And Trump did not help with that subtle messaging. Obviously, that's beyond him.
So by the way, Victor, where does the Financial Times stand on chlorinated chicken?
I expect we're against it. We certainly were in favour of Remain. I don't know where we stand on that now. But I thought the sad thing was that the satirical magazine Private Eye had a front page cover for Theresa May's departure with all her achievements, and it was just a blank white front page of Private Eye, this magazine, and because the view in Britain is that she's just ended up dividing the country.
When she stood in front of Downing Street and did get a bit emotional, announcing that she was stepping down as leader of the Conservatives, she drew a lot of sympathy. People said, "Look, this was mission impossible anyway."
I guess that's right, but I think a lot of people also thought she could have done a lot better. She on the BBC this morning, there was a commentator saying she'd left everything more divided. She's left the country more divided. She's left her party, the Conservative Party, more divided. She's left Parliament more divided, and that is not an achievement.
I think it's hilarious because the end of May is like another Brexit. She's leaving, but in the end, she's still staying. So nothing has changed. just really sad.
It will change.
I mean, it's almost like shifting the deck chairs around on the Titanic, isn't it? I mean, it's still, the iceberg is still there. Will Brexit happen? Won't Brexit happen? Who's going to be in the driving seat when it's meant to happen? It just goes from one completely bizarre situation to another.
And then when we look at those candidates who are around, there's not one of them who really has a clear plan for Brexit. Yeah. Among the 11, there's one who is for a second referendum, which I think is still the best choice because when they voted, they didn't know what they voted for.
We'll see if Conservative Party rank and file vote for that one.
Right, but all the other who are around, they don't have a clue what they're going to do with Brexit.
Yeah, and remember her main purpose as Prime Minister, as she said herself, Brexit means Brexit. She was going to deliver it with a deal, and in the end, she didn't deliver it. So even the thing which a lot of, half the British people don't want anyway, she didn't even achieve that. I think it's not a good legacy, unfortunately.
And also, there's always talking about going back to Brussels and renegotiating. If there's nothing else Michel Barnier has said in the last few months is, we are not negotiating anything else. The withdrawal agreement, that's it. There's no more negotiating. But they're still talking about going back to Brussels and getting a better deal.
Nico Hines, talk us through the coming months, because we have a leadership contest now for the Conservatives, right? Then there's summer recess for the Parliament, and October 31st is the looming deadline for Brexit Day now.
And traditionally, nothing really happens in British politics from around about now or in a month's time, as you say, summer recess at the end of July, until actually October itself, because that's when the Conservative Party conference
and we could get Nico in between.
October.
We could get in between, perhaps, if there's a vote of no confidence, a general election, right?
That's right. Yeah. So it's interesting talking about what has changed. And look, there are lots of different candidates running, and they all have very different perspectives. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter what they say. The EU's position is basically going to stay the same, and potentially more importantly, the balance of power within the House of Commons is exactly the same, because it's not going to be any easier for either a moderate, soft Tory Brexiteer or a hard one like Dominic Raab or Boris Johnson. They're still going to be trying to convince the same MPs to come to some sort of compromise, and nobody wants to make a compromise. So it looks to me as though we're heading for some sort of electoral event, because even the hardcore candidates, and so far only, one or two of them have said that they will actually do something called proroguing Parliament, which basically means shutting Parliament down in order to force a no-deal Brexit through at the end of October. I mean, this would be absolutely one of the most controversial, constitutionally problematic things to have happened in hundreds of years in this country. I was meeting with some other kind of, shall we say, fringe elements this week who were suggesting that they could actually call an election just before the no-deal date is reached, so that there'll be no one here to take a vote, and then we'll accidentally fall out to try and force through a no-deal. But at the moment, there really is no clear way forward other than to have either a vote or a second referendum. Now, the second referendum, absolutely nobody will say that they want that. However,
nobody in the Conservative Party.
When it comes to a vote in Parliament, it is possible that someone could convince MPs to hold a second referendum, because that means they get to keep their jobs. If they have an election instead, then they may all be out of a job.
All right, Europe watching the endless Brexit and Donald Trump on one side. On the other, well, they got Russia and China to worry about. We'll talk about it. When we come back, you're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. London editor Nico Hines is with us for this edition. Welcome back as well to German television producer Ulrike Koltermann. Catherine Field, Europe correspondent for New Zealand Media, and Victor Mallet, Paris bureau chief for the Financial Times. We were talking about allies of D-Day, a bit at cross purposes for this 75th anniversary. Russia, you'll recall, was invited to the 70th anniversary of D-Day to the Normandy beaches, partly because there was also a sideline summit on Ukraine at the time during the height of the crisis there. This time around, the Kremlin suggesting that this whole D-Day Atlantic Alliance thing is a non-event.
According to historians, the Normandy landing did not fundamentally influence the outcome of World War II. This was predetermined as a result of Red Army victories, mostly in Stalingrad and Kursk.
Does Maria Zakharova have a point, Catherine Field?
She does have a point.
She
and by not inviting Vladimir Putin, they have really fed into the paranoia, the hatred and the distrust in Russia that they haven't been really fully appreciated in the writing of the history of the Second World War. 27 million Russians died in the Second World War, and Russia is always saying, you're not taking this seriously. We made a big contribution. It was an enormous sacrifice. Some of the battles in the Eastern Front were enormous. She has a point. And it really wouldn't have made all that much difference to the setting of the table placements and things if the French had invited Putin.
I think it would have been a good idea to invite a little bit larger, invite Putin and also invite Merkel, because it was the last time that we had veterans around. They say they invite them on the 70s and maybe on the 80s, but why?
And
not
they invited
this time?
him for the armistice.
Yeah, and she definitely had a point. There was actually an opinion poll about the Russian participation of liberating Europe, and just after the World War, it was the perception that of the role of Russia was much bigger than today. So this is totally shifted, and I think it would have been important to show all sides. Now it looked like an American-French summit, more or less, with Trump and Macron playing their roles, but it would have been better to invite more leaders.
Yeah, and
the only thing was, I mean, it was the anniversary of D-Day, which was the landings in Normandy, and the Russians were not part of that. So, in that sense, it's not particularly.
Yeah, which is contrived, inviting him to the 70th or not inviting him to the 70th.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, we don't know whether they would have accepted, but it is worth remembering. This is not like the end of the war in Europe, for example, where it would be very odd not to invite the Russians.
All right, better than a Normandy landing, a boat ride with Vlad, Russia's president, showing his Chinese counterpart the sights of his native St. Petersburg. Xi Jinping on a 3-day visit to Russia. They attended the big economic forum, Victor Mallet, that they go to every year. Also, Huawei inking a deal with Russia's largest telecoms operator to build 5G networks for the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, these are two of the big authoritarian powers in the world. I think it's worth pointing out that China is very much the senior partner now, with an economy about 8 times the size of Russia's, which wasn't the case, of course, 30 or 40 years ago. So you have a complete sort of power shift there. But yeah, these two countries obviously have common interests, in particular in countering the sort of Western narrative of democracy, freedom, and.
But this boat ride also an illustration, you might say, again, of that world order that's kind of in flux, where old allies talk at each other at cross purposes. And I don't know how much of a new alliance it is, because Russia and China have also had their issues in the past.
They have, and I think they'll continue to do so. But China's very keen on getting access to energy imports from Russia. Gas in particular, oil and gas. So, they have a sort of interdependence. And I think a lot of people, they do have a lot of mutual suspicion based on the past. But I think the kind of relationship has developed beyond what people expected into a closer relationship and a more important one. And I think that's partly because of, the way the US has started sort of turning away from its international alliances with the rest of the world.
All right, so there's the 75th anniversary of D-Day. One event that definitely was not commemorated this week in China was the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. It ended a student uprising of more than 5 weeks. It also spelled doom for the reformist wing of the Communist Party back in 1989 and set China on its current political course. At a regional summit in Singapore last weekend, China's defense secretary, unabashed.
Do you think the government was wrong with the handling of June 4th? There was a conclusion to that incident. It was political turmoil the central government needed to quell. The government was decisive in stopping the turbulence. That was the correct policy.
There's a saying in China: no politician wants to be known as the Chinese Gorbachev.
Indeed. Well, they've gone all out. The Chinese Communist Party got back in the saddle. They're running the show. Xi is very much in charge of the whole show. So they have to keep the same narrative on Tiananmen as they've always had. It was chaos. It was chaos that was instituted by rogues who are students at the university who were fed all sorts of misinformation from foreign agents. So they've got to keep the lid on it. It's unfortunate because when we look at what's happening in China, it's no different, if not it's worse today than it was in Tiananmen when you look at who's being the controls on freedom of speech, academic freedom, on who can come, who can go. Nothing has changed. If anything, it's wrong. And it's very interesting that we just saw those pictures of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. These are two men that operate very strictly controlled societies. It's not just here and a bit of internet censorship here and there. It is very controlled.
Nico Hines, 30 years ago, we all thought the French president at the time said a regime that shoots on its own youth is doomed to failure. François Mitterrand was very wrong because it's been 30 years and China's gone from strength to strength. Nonetheless, when you hear Catherine Field talk about how there's a tightening of the screws in such important fields as academia, does that make China a giant with a feet of clay?
Potentially, although if you look at the kind of global economic trends over that 30-year period, I don't think feet of clay really sums it up. I mean, it's been a success story, no matter what you think of it morally, ethically. And I think, this week, the fact that Putin and Xi are meeting, I don't think there's any doubt that was the more important summit of the week. And Xi's saying that Putin is his best friend, and Putin saying, let's end the hegemony of the US dollar in world currency. I mean, okay, that might be a bit of a pipe dream, but I think, it shows the ambition that these countries have. And I don't think that we should take it for granted that they won't be able to achieve that. Russia and China pursuing kind of tougher and stricter regimes. And of course, what we've seen in other parts of the world, like in Sudan, are also reminiscent, obviously, of Tiananmen. But what they do in China now is so much more sophisticated. They've got a much tighter control than they had over those students in the 80s, but they just do it in much more sophisticated, cunning, clever ways, and more wicked ways in many ways. I mean, if you look at what's happening with the Uyghurs. So I don't think feet of clay sums it up. I'd be very concerned about them.
Where Tiananmen was commemorated on Tuesday was Hong Kong, where 120,000 turned out for a candlelight vigil. Hong Kong, where there are newfound fears that civil liberties are to be further quashed. When you look at those images, Victor Mallet, what's your reaction?
Well, interesting. This was one of the largest Tiananmen celebrations or commemorations that we've seen in Hong Kong for many, many years. I think in some people say it's the largest ever. And what it shows is that while censorship and economic success has essentially kept the youth of mainland China very quiet, in places like Hong Kong, that is not the case at all, because Hong Kong has not had censorship until now, and the Hong Kong people are extremely nervous that Chinese authoritarianism is already beginning to crush Hong Kong's supposed autonomy, which is meant to last until 2047, and obviously isn't going to do so because it's already being withdrawn. We've seen cases of university professors put in jail essentially for their political views. There's an extradition law coming which will allow China to extradite people that it doesn't like, and we've had the first cases of Hong Kongers granted refugee status in Germany to Hong Kong political activists, freedom activists, democracy activists, who are now living in Germany because they essentially need to be protected from Hong Kong's system. This is a very worrying development for the people of Hong Kong.
I think what's important when we see these pictures from Hong Kong is these commemorations don't just happen every 10 years. It's every single year in Hong Kong, in Victoria Park and Causeway Bay. They come out. They have not forgotten, despite what the Chinese Communist Party tries to do to shut all this down. They haven't forgotten. And picking up on what Nico was saying from London, it's how the West reacts to it. Well, I could not imagine anyone standing up against the Chinese Communist Party at the moment. We've allowed them into the WTO. We've brought them into all sorts of international agreements. And thinking back again to 1989, here in Paris, the Bastille Day parade, they had the goddess of democracy leading the parade down the Champs-Élysées. And it should have been France's year for the parade. It was the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. I can't imagine that happening in a Western country, that there'd be so much said about democracy in China.
Lots of reactions on the hashtag world this week, including this one. Sudan's the new Tiananmen Square. Please, world, join and watch this. They want democracy. Nico Hines was talking about it. Will June 3rd be remembered as Sudan's Tiananmen? Leaders of the junta there returning from regional summits in the Gulf and cracking down on the peaceful sit-in outside army headquarters in Khartoum. At least 113 killed among those pressing for a transition to civilian rule after they forced out longtime strongman Omar al-Bashir. Now here you're seeing images of Ethiopia's reformist leader, Abiy Ahmed, who's come in to mediate and to speak to both sides. Ulrike Kolterman, first of all, will this week be remembered as Sudan's Tiananmen? The students haven't said their last word, neither have the opposition leaders.
I think it's still ongoing, and the international community is not paying that much attention to it because there's so much other news, and it's Khartoum and it's going on forever. But there's something really serious happening, because what happened in Darfur years ago, in 2003, there was a genocide going on, and these are actually the same people. What was happening in Darfur is now happening in Khartoum, and the guy is still the same. And
the leader of what was then known as the Janjaweed militia,
Mr. Dagalo, he is still in power, and he's got the support of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, because he sent militia to fight in Yemen. So it's not only a local fight between different factions. That is something really serious happening there.
Victor Mount?
Well, we're seeing a reflection here of some of the geopolitical trends we've been talking about. The United States is not going to stand up for democracy in the way that it used to in a place like Sudan, because it doesn't care that much, and this is very unfortunate. And China and Russia, whose leaders we saw together, are actually going to actively work against it.
Yeah, they vetoed a resolution.
Exactly, they vetoed a resolution in the UN condemning the military crackdown, the military killings in Sudan, and in a way, this shows you the way the geopolitics is moving in essentially a very negative direction if you believe in democracy and freedom.
That junta in Khartoum, though, it's not monolithic as such.
No, I mean, that's the problem of Sudan. Bashir stayed in power for 3 decades because he used to play off the different factions, and that's the whole problem in Sudan. And as the international community doesn't pay much attention, it's going on and on and on. And now a very brutal militia is back in power. And if you look at the methods, I mean, the people are not only killed; they found the bodies in the River Nile, and these are exactly the same methods that they used in Darfur.
Yeah, and the use of rape as a weapon of war. Before we go, it's becomes something of a tradition in this country. The French president visits the national football team before a World Cup, which we then go on to win. Last June, Emmanuel Macron brought the men luck. So how about the women? Les Bleus, with an ES, if you're spelling it the French way, kick off this Friday at home at the Parc des Princes against South Korea. And yes, we're kind of feeling football fever in this country. 70% of tickets already sold for the tournament. Decent TV ratings for the warm-up matches, and genuine interest. So the question is, well, first of all, Nico Hines, will you be watching the Women's World Cup?
Absolutely, I can't wait. And I think you can't really gauge the interest now. Yes, people are kind of trying to pay a bit of attention, but I tell you what, if France get through and start winning some knockout games, get to the quarterfinals, the semi-finals, then yeah, I think everyone's going to get excited, and it'll be the same here. England did surprisingly well at the last World Cup 4 years ago, and by the end, the whole nation was watching, even though it was in the US and it was bad TV viewing times for us. So no, I think it's going to be huge, and it's noticeably different here now. Advertisers are always a key indicator for me, and the posters around, on the buses and the tubes around here are full of pictures of these female athletes that we're about to see.
All right, so have women broken football's glass ceiling? Not quite yet, if you listen to England and Lyon defender Lucy Bronze.
Younger, definitely, and it is a different game when you compare the route to the top in the men's game and the women's game. It is harder. The boys, they get to play 5 times a week for their academies. It's all paid for. They get their education on top of it, and they do that from the age of 6 till they're 20, till they become a professional. Whereas you look at the girls' game, and they'll be lucky to train twice a week.
Still a ways to go.
It's a long way to go, and it was very interesting that the Norwegian player, she's not coming to the tournament because of this issue of women not being paid the same as men. And it's just appalling. I was just thinking, it's so last century when we're talking about women athletes not getting the same as men. It's even more bizarre. We're talking about football, tennis, all these sports that women, they're not even getting 50% of what men are paid. So, yeah, it's a real shame. But it's good to see that there's so much excitement. On my way here tonight, there were just people out on the streets getting ready for the match. I think it's a real shame that the first match isn't at the Stade de France. It should be at the National Stadium. And I also think the final should also be at the National Stadium. It shouldn't be down in Lyon. This is a tournament that France is hosting, and they can fill that Stade de France.
Now, there's a good reason why it's in France's second city, Lyon, which is that Lyon is sort of this maverick club where you do have parity, gender parity, with the football academies, where you have this tradition of boosting the women's side. I think they're European champions for I don't know how many years in a row. Do you agree with Catherine that the final should be in Paris?
Well, I think Lyon is a good place, and it's definitely true that this is not only about football, it's about gender equity. Everyone is talking about it. And there's another big question, because if the US team will win again and keep the title, will Donald Trump come and see the final? We don't know.
I have a personal interest in it. I hope it's in Paris because I live here and I want to watch the matches with my daughter, who's a keen football player and plays for her university team. So let's hope so. But I mean, I suppose I should go to Lyon. We should go to Lyon to watch it.
Lyon and other points. One more point on this, Nico Hines. When you look at powerhouse Lyon's run, you were telling me before the show that women's football has come such a long way that its rank as the undisputed champion of Europe could soon be under pressure?
Well, there's something interesting happening in the game over here, which is that the big boys are starting to take it seriously. For years and years, there was a team called the Doncaster Belles, were the biggest team in women's football. And over recent years, teams like Arsenal have been leading the way. But now, the really big teams, Manchester City and Manchester United, have started to take it seriously. And Manchester United actually had their very first ever season in the second tier this year, and they won 18 of the 20 games. They scored 98 goals and conceded 7. They were just smashing everybody out of sight because they had all this new money. And I think, make no mistake, these big Premier League brands are now coming for women's football, and they will help to propel it further forward as the kind of glory hunters get on the bandwagon. And I would say teams like Lyon need to watch out.
All right. The warning comes to us from London. Let the games begin. Nico Hines, many thanks for joining us. I want to thank Catherine Field, Victor Mallet, Ulrika Kolterman. Stay with us, though. Media Watch is next. All right, we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
Catherine had quite a few grievances there about the World Cup. Why isn't the final in Paris? How come they're not paid enough?
Well, yes, and it's a question that a lot of people are asking, especially about the money. And you would think that in a post-Me Too era, maybe we'd be looking at the Women's Football World Cup a little differently this time around. I found it interesting when I spotted this cartoon online. It was done by Mike Thompson. You play like a girl, says the banner, and one of the gentlemen in the crowd says, remember when that was an insult? Now, the interesting thing about this cartoon is it was done in 1999. It was done for the very first Women's World Cup, and I'm really not sure that we've come all that far since then, to be honest. It's sort of give with one hand, take with the other. L'Équipe seems to be taking it quite seriously. They have this headline, can we do it again? Hoping that the women's team can echo, of course, what we saw the men pull off, and we could be the double champions of the world. Doesn't seem too likely to happen if you...
Yeah, the Germans beat us last time. By the way.
Yes, absolutely.
Good again.
But it is interesting to see that L'Équipe also has this as its magazine cover tomorrow.
Right.
This is Wanda Nara, dubbed the Atomic Blonde, and she's an agent who is apparently shaking up Italian football and, of course, has to be posing with her boob half out in a pair of leather trousers. I'm not quite sure why they felt it necessary to do that, but it does feel a little bit gratuitous, like they just thought, oh, let's go with the glamorous blonde, because maybe we don't find the female footballers attractive.
So hang on, this is not a football player, this is an agent.
Yes.
Okay.
Which they're featuring as the Women's World Cup kicks off. It does seem a little bit to me like, let's please the men reading L'Équipe and stick a blonde with large bosoms on the cover. Le Parisien goes with a more positive headline, although it is the words of a former player rather than the editorial team. Women's football is more than just isn't just a subcategory, says Melissa Plaza. And there are quite a few things out there at the moment that do seem to be trying to tackle sexism head-on when it comes to football. One of England's sponsors has actually created a video that is a reworking of Three Lions, which is the big fan favourite, the song. Unfortunately, they haven't done the whole song. They've done the rather boring, wordy bit at the beginning. But some of it's pretty nice. Take a look at this video.
So many sneers, all those, well done, girls. Wear you down through the years. But we still see that tackle by more. And when Nikita scored, Steffi belting the ball and Nobsy dancing. Football's coming home.
I'm not sure that football's going to be coming home because England aren't big favourites either. I think the best message about sexism and how we really shouldn't have it comes from the German team, who produced a video, an advert that has gone viral. And its tagline is, we don't have balls, but we know how to use them. And it's a great video. It talks about how they've battled sexism from the minute that they started competing, that people think they're not good enough, that they're not fast enough. They simply don't even know their names. They don't know that they've won the European Championship 8 times. It's a great video, well worth taking a look at. Millions of people have watched it already, I have to say. Interestingly, the German men's team have got in on the act, creating their own little video. I'm not sure this is quite as woke as they thought it was, though, because it appears to be the men's team making breakfast. And the implication to me is that if the women weren't occupied with the World Cup, then it would be them at the helm cooking breakfast. So I'm not quite sure what they're trying to say with this video, I have to say.
Is that how you interpret it, Ulrika?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you're right.
And it's not the first time that the Germans have got it a little bit wrong, may I say. Back in 2011, very different message from the German women's team. This is them posing for Playboy, which I must admit, I was quite shocked at. You get enough sexism as it is if you are a female footballer to pose in that way. One of the things that they say in that advert that everyone loves is they're talking about the fact that, yes, women can wear heels, they can dress up and be sexy, but that doesn't make us any less serious when we're on the pitch.
Right. Well, you know, here in France, there's the local rugby team which sells a lot of calendars of men who
Well, I don't know what
in their
you're
birthday
talking about.
suits.
I've never bought one of those calendars.
Right.
Okay, I do have a few, I'll be honest. Lots of typical remarks that we're seeing online like this one, people saying, why do we have to label them as Australia women, Brazil women? We all know it's the Women's World Cup. This guy, very typical, no sexism or machoism intended. Women's football is plain boring.
Wrong
But I
on
think
that
the worst thing that I've seen actually comes from a British media outlet, which will remain nameless. This is the worst thing I have seen. They are talking about introducing Scotland's World Cup team, and they say who's the sassiest, who's the doziest, who likes to look all stunning on Instagram, and who's prone to some sexy singing on the team bus. Can you imagine them saying the same thing about the men's Scottish squad? It would never happen.
Indeed. Many thanks for that, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.